And so, but you've concentrated on that in a way that just isn't characteristic of anybody on the political landscape at all. Now it's become an issue that's front and center. And so I'd like to hear more about your thoughts, why you think that's such a fundamental priority, compared to, say, free speech and war and peace. Why health? And what you see, lay out the landscape of the problem and also the landscape of potential solution.
Yeah, so we are now the sickest country in the world. We have the highest chronic disease burden in the world. When my uncle was president, I was a 10-year-old boy. About 6% of Americans had chronic illness, and today 60%. When my uncle was president, we spent zero in this country on chronic disease, zero. And today, and for many chronic diseases, first of all, there weren't even diagnoses and there weren't drugs available. Today, we spend $4.3 trillion, so about 95% of our health budget. It's the biggest, and it's 5 times our military costs. It's the biggest item in our budget, and it is the fastest growing. And not only that, so it's destroying our country economically, absolutely debilitating it. All of our other issues are small towards it. If you just measure its economic impact, it has other impacts. 77% of American children are no longer eligible for the military because of chronic disease.
And is that obesity related with kids?
Obesity is one of them. Obesity when my uncle was president was 3.4%. Today it's 74%.
And what do you think is driving the obesity epidemic?
It's
such a transformation.
Yeah, I mean, it's being driven by poison food, by ultra-processed wheat, sugar, and flour, seed oils, soy, canola, sunflower, and then wheat and corn, which are all heavily subsidized. So those 90% of farm subsidies, the crop insurance, et cetera, go to those 3 categories of soy, corn, and wheat. And those are the feedstocks for all of our processed foods. They turn into sugar. They're all nutrient barren. The original crops were nutrient rich, but the GMO crops are nutrient barren, and they're heavily dependent on pesticides. The reason GMOs are so popular is because they're resistant to pests. The reason they're resistant to pests is because they are resistant to pesticides like glyphosate. So you can saturate the whole landscape with glyphosate from airplanes, and that the only thing that's green is GMO corn, which is Roundup ready. It's called Roundup resistant corn. And because of that, it's also very, very heavily laden with pesticides. Wheat, glyphosate is also used as a desiccant, which means it dries out wheat. So it's sprayed on the wheat right at harvest, which means it's going right into the food. And when that began in 1993, that's when you saw all the appearance of all these gluten allergies and celiac disease and wheat allergies that you don't have in Europe. You can eat spaghetti here and you're going to get eczema and all of these stomach complaints. Then you go to Italy and you eat it and you get thin. Mm-hmm. But here, and then the corn is turned into high fructose corn syrup, which is just a formula for making you obese and diabetic. And Americans, diabetes is one of the diseases. When I was a kid, the average pediatrician saw 1 case of diabetes in his lifetime. So a 40 or 50-year career, he may see 1 case of juvenile diabetes. And today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. And we spend more on diabetes than our military budget. So that is, and nobody's talking about this.
Yeah, right.
These are all of these autoimmune disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, Alzheimer's is a form of diabetes. Mm-hmm. It's type 3 diabetes. It comes from poison food.
So is it how much of it do you think is the toxin load per se, and how much of it do you think is carbohydrate?
It's the overload of sugars, because all of those grains turn into sucrose, and they're very low in nutrients. So we're malnourishing kids. You know, you're seeing high levels of obesity, and in the same people who have high levels of obesity, there's also high levels of malnutrition. The most malnourished people in this country are the most overweight.
Right.
Because they're eating food like
substances. Yeah.
And then
that's a good phrase.
And then they're covered with chemicals and pesticides. Plus, some of those are part of the food processing, but some of them are pesticides, etc. There's 1,000 ingredients in our food that are illegal in Europe and other countries. So we're just mass poisoning us, and nobody has chronic disease epidemic like we do in our country. That's why one of the reasons we had the highest death rate from COVID. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in this country. We only have 4.2% of the world's population. And so we did worse than any other country. And the CDC explains that, says it's not our fault. It's because Americans are so sick. CDC said the average American who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases.
Right.
So it wasn't COVID, it was killing them. It was chronic disease, right? And you know, we have the sickest, we have the highest chronic disease burden, we have the highest COVID death rate. But it's not just, it's those autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes, lupus, Crohn's disease, all this IBS. All of these things had suddenly appeared in the mid-'80s. That, you know, I never knew anybody with any of those diseases when I was a kid.
Yeah, right.
The neurological diseases, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, sleep disorders, Tourette syndrome, ASD, autism. Autism rates in my generation, 70-year-old men, is about between 1 in 1,500 and 1 in 10,000. That's what it is today. My children's generation is 1 in every 34 kids, according to CDC, 1 in every 22 in California. So, you know, and it is devastating our generation. It's our economy. It's going to cause autism alone.
So
there's a recent paper by Mark Blaxell that shows it'll cost $1 trillion a year by 2030. And then the allergic disease again, which I never saw as a kid. I had 11 siblings, 70 first cousins. I never knew anybody with a peanut allergy. Mm-hmm. I do 5, but my 7 kids have allergies. You know, it's.
So you're up against some major forces in fighting that particular battle. I mean, first of all, you have to sway public opinion in that direction. And then there's going to be a massive force arrayed against any possible interventions. That's for sure.